So I wanted to try to do something a little bit different instead of the usual churn and burn of decks on this channel. I wanted to take a minute or like 60 minutes to talk about all of the decks I built during this Wild of Eldraine season of deck building and, what we learned, how my thought process evolved, and also to kind of take a moment to kind of clearly state the mission thesis of what I like to do as a Magic content creator. My Twitch stream and, by proxy, my YouTube channel is all about me trying to innovate upon the modern format, or potentially pioneer legacy one day. Trying to innovate on the modern format and trying to find creative new ways to build decks, trying to learn and trying to have these ideas build upon each other. And I think the Wild of Eldraine season was a particularly good showcase of that, where we got three really big, important new modern staples, and it was a really exciting time to dive into these cards, really explore what you could do with them, what you couldn't do with them. And I think we had a lot of really, really good successes with these cards and some kind of fun failures too. And so tentatively, I would like to do a video like this every set. So we'll see how this goes. But I think this would be a fun way to recap what we've learned. And for people who aren't able to tune in as often, this can be a good way to keep up with ideas if you're not able to keep up with them, every day, every week. So I've spent some time curating a PowerPoint of every single deck I played during the Wilds of Eldraine season on stream, and I've sorted them for each of the new cards we were building around. I sorted them in chronological order we played them on stream. So these were all decks kind of happening simultaneously, but I thought it would be cool to just take a look at the first Up the Beanstalk deck we played and where we are at now with Up the Beanstalk, and doing the same thing for Agatha Soul Cauldron, Questing Druid, Knight of Sweet Revenge. And then at the end, I have a lot of miscellaneous decks that we played along the way. Despite some of the later Bean decks getting really weird and playing a lot of goofy cards, the majority of them are going to follow this formula, playing Fury, Solitude, Leyline Binding alongside Beanstalk to wipe your opponent's board and draw a ton of cards. When I played this deck for the first time, this was a couple days into the Wilds of Eldraine format, the 4-color lists with One Ring and Omnath were popping up, and I think those lists were kind of immediately showing a lot of promise. I wanted to try to just build something different. That's kind of what I do on the channel, is try non-conventional deck building strategies. And I had always been kind of interested in a Naya build like this that used Chalice of the Void and Reprieve as their non-creature sources of interaction. I think Chalice was a little bit better positioned at the time of playing this deck. And I was pretty impressed by the formula of Up the Beanstalk, Fury, Solitude. I think, most people were I think very immediately impressed by the card. That being said, I didn't think that this build was, I didn't think that Chalice of the Void was a particularly good direction. I didn't think that there was enough reason to just be Naya over 4-color, but I thought that maybe there was enough reason to be Bant instead of 4-color, getting to have access to Counterspell, Logic Knot, these actual counterspells can also help you against some of the non-creature decks that the 4-color Omnath decks can struggle with. And there's also this really, really good suggestion from friend of the channel, Anurag, NZ MTG, of playing Logic Knot as a counterspell that can trigger Up the Beanstalk. And this deck was really exciting. I've been actually wanting to circle back to it lately. I would build it a little bit differently, probably no Shark Typhoons, less Nissas, but this was a deck that I was liking a lot. And the big thing for me here too, I think this is the first time where I really felt Up the Beanstalk had potential to be better than the One Ring, where the One Ring in blue-white control decks always felt like a big liability. You had very few ways to gain life. Dying to your ring happened way more in blue-white X control than anywhere else. And so using Up the Beanstalk as your card advantage engine made a lot of sense to me, since this is, it's lower on the mana curve, so you're happy to have multiple copies in your opening hand. It's easier to resolve your card advantage engine, and of course, it is not dealing you any damage. And I'm pretty proud that we had this somewhat early. Maybe it wasn't the craziest thing to have, but I think this deck eventually evolved into what was maybe the best brew of the season. But before we got to that deck, the best brew of the season, I did spend some time playing Up the Beanstalk and some older pet decks of mine. This Invasion of Alara, Vampire Hexmage, Feldar Saheeli Shell. The stream actually went pretty well. I remember our record overall was pretty high. Invasion of Alara, when you cast this card in this deck, a lot of the time you're going to hit a Guardian or a Hexmage to just generate insane amount of value. And then obviously having the formula of Beanstalk, Fury, Leyline Binding, Solitude does buy you a lot of time to get up to Invasion of Alara. And I also feel Nissa shines so much in this list too. Just giving you that kind of explosive amount of mana while also being a little bit lower on the curve than Omnath felt really important to me. Ultimately, this is not a deck I would really recommend because the curve is like just kind of too high in a scam metagame, and Invasion of Alara is kind of weak against a Fairy Time Raveler, but this is a very, very fun deck if you're looking for something sweet for F&M. We also played it in this Heartless Summoning Brought-Back package that we played on the stream before. I really, really like that in this deck, you have 4 Heartless Summonings and you have 4 Brought-Backs, and if you have either 2 fetch lands brought back on turn 2 or a Heartless Summoning on turn 2, you have like really explosive amount of mana. And then when you add up the Beanstalk, you also have the nuts of just turn 2 up the Beanstalk. So I really like that the shell had like just 12 really, really strong turn 2 plays, and this deck felt like it had like just a ridiculous inevitable late game where you would just be casting Muldrifters and Elish Norns and Atali, and you would be copying Atali's ability with Elish Norn, and you'd be ephemerating Atali. It was really crazy, and Atali would only cost 5 mana. Just a really ridiculous deck. Something that I've been kind of wanting to return to lately now that Scam is down on Blood Moons. I think that this is probably a pretty good formula for beating that deck game 1, and then you have a bunch of Celestial Purges in games 2 and 3. I would probably iterate on the formula a little bit, but I was like relatively happy with the main deck, and I think this deck was a little bit of a sleeper despite being, you know, I don't know. This is one of the decks that kind of looks like it's a meme. Usually has a really high win record on stream, but you know, is still like not exactly what I'd recommend for a tournament. And then after a couple of weeks of like just thinking Up the Beanstalk was ridiculous every single time I cast it, I thought about playing it in decks that were, you know, not just playing it with Fury Solitude, trying to find like any other shell to like both play 5+ mana spells quickly, but you know, something a little bit less standard. And so this was kind of the first draft of Timeless Lotus with Up the Beanstalk. It ended up going pretty well, and Beanstalk ended up looking pretty good. And what's kind of funny to me about this deck list is that it's very close to where we're at with this archetype now. And there was like a pretty big breakthrough on this archetype recently, but this was also like a little bit before I think players really understood how ridiculous Up the Beanstalk was. I had this list pretty early, and people understood that Up the Beanstalk was a playable modern card, but I think people at this point didn't quite recognize that Up the Beanstalk is just a modern staple and is actually the best card advantage engine in modern, in my opinion, and like more powerful than the One Ring, and just like so hard to trade with favorably because it's 2 mana. And so I think that this deck ended up getting a little bit more attention later, but I'm pretty proud that we had it this early. From there, I was looking at older brews I had that played cards with mana values that could trigger Bean cheaply, and I stumbled across this like old hit of mine, the Calibrated Blast, Witch's Cottage deck. If you're not familiar, the idea of this deck is that you're going to use Witch's Cottage to put Scion of Draco or Shadow of Mortality on top of your library, then cast Calibrated Blast to deal your opponent, 15 or 12 damage. And then you can also just put like a Fury on top, a Troll of Khazad-dûm for 5 or 6 damage. And Scion of Draco, 2 mana, 12 mana value, triggers Up the Beanstalk. Shadow of Mortality is also a card that you end up casting a lot in this deck. Your mana base is pretty painful. You can cast the card more often than you expect, and it also triggers Up the Beanstalk, and then also gets lifelink with Scion of Draco, which can be pretty powerful. And I think this deck was very good. It kind of got overshadowed because after this we had the infamous Cascade Bean deck take off, but like this was like 1 week where on Monday we were like 11-4 on stream with this deck. It was very impressive. The next day we played this deck for the first time. This was the first deck that I played that was just casting Shardless Agent and trying to cascade into Up the Beanstalk. I had seen a few other times players play Up the Beanstalks in Cascade Shells, but basically always with other cards. Like they would just play some copies of Up the Beanstalk in Rhinos. I think Dak Faden was the person I saw doing this, but I hadn't seen anybody just try to cascade into only Up the Beanstalk. And after playing, with a lot of these shells, and this is just the kind of idea that you can't have without playing with a lot of different shells, I wanted to try it in like the taking turn shell, kind of like what Reed Duke played on the Modern Super League. So it was like more or less these like 4-color mid-range shells, but you don't play any counter spells, you don't play any Wrenn and 6, and you don't play any 1-mana removal spells, but the 1-mana removal spells are kind of mediocre in the format anyways. and just every single time you cast Shardless Agent, you put an up the Beanstalk into play. And this build was, in on like the Time Warp taking turn plans, and this deck actually still does exist, and a lot of other players have put work into it, and like the Time Warp versions are pretty good. You can play Bring to Light to get multiple triggers off your Beanstalk when you Bring to Light for Time Warp instead. But like this ended up being like a really good archetype. But this also like evolved like the very next day. Like we were like 11-4 on stream with this deck, and then we had a very strong record with this deck too. I think it was also 11-4. It may have been like 10-5. It may have been 12-3. But then that immediately turned into this deck, which I think was like definitely the most impactful brew of the season. There's a good chance you're already familiar, but this is the Bloodbraid Beans deck, like definitely like the brew of the season. The very next day after this Cascade Bean turns deck, we went Monday 11-4 with the Calibrated Blast Bean deck. Tuesday, I think 12-3 with this deck, and I think we went like Wednesday and Thursday 13-2 or something ridiculous like that with this Bloodbraid Elf 4-color Fury build using Fire Ice to get like a density of pitchable cards for Fury. This deck was really, really exciting. I think this formula of like just the 4-color deck with no One Ring, where you have Shardless Agent and sometimes Bloodbraid Elf to cascade into Up the Beanstalk. It's just so exciting when you have a deck like this before everyone else, and it's just so clearly one of the best things to be doing in the format. Streaming with this deck was just like having lightning in a bottle, having electricity in your hands. It was very, very exciting. Like I was just so hyped and energetic about it. Chat was energetic. It was a really, really special time on the stream, and like really exactly what it is I try to do on the channel is like find these like ways to reinvent the formula of a deck and set it out there. Like when I was first like playing this deck, like the idea of cutting Rin and 6 from 4-color, not playing any 1-mana removal spells, was like a really ridiculous thing to some people. And in my opinion, this is still like the best way to build the 4-color archetype, although I would build it pretty differently now. It was, I'll say this, very difficult for me to try to tune this list. I think once we had like the initial shell out, it was very exciting, but like basically 3 days after I came up with this list on like that Wednesday, on like that Saturday, like the modern metagame was changing so much. People were playing the deck a lot. They're playing a lot of like toolboxy techie cards for the mirror. People were playing like Burn and Valakut to counter it. Scam like immediately started playing more Shieldreds. It was like really all over the place in a way that was very difficult for me to adapt to, I think. And a lot of other deck builders and players started working the deck, and I think there's some great lists out there. And I haven't really like figured out exactly the 75 I would play right now, but I want to soon. I want to hammer out a Blood Beans 75. But the deck was just so exciting, and I think I already said this, but to me this is just what it's all about. Like taking like the formula of decks that just kind of exist, just trying to work on them, and then it's just like a lot of failure and a lot of like your ideas not being as good as the traditional ideas, but even in these like failures, your ideas build upon each other, and eventually you can find something really special like this. And then after like a week of trying to play with this deck, a few other things in between, I decided to have like a little bit of fun and play a deck that I knew was like not very good, but like just so sweet, and kind of take that same formula of cascading into Up the Beanstalk and trying to just burn your opponent's face with Soul Spike and Needle Bite Trap and Thunderous Wrath. And you also have Chancellor to Dross to like for 0 mana, drain your opponent for 3, and then pitch it to Soul Spike later. And this deck was not very good, but when it went off, it was something that was really, really cool. And this is definitely the kind of like kind of deck I like to put out there for people to play at FNM or just to have fun with for a little bit. And we kind of had another one of these like less good, more aggressive formulas with instead of playing Solitude and Leyline Binding, we're playing Allosaurus Rider and Fury of the Horde and Hooting Mandrills to just like put a lot of creatures into play that are drawing a lot of cards as well. I think that this build, we also have like a slightly updated version of this build later. I think this build would have been a lot better if I had found it first, like before people were really ready to like fight the Cascade Bean formula. But by the time I got here, people were just like like used to fighting against this formula that I think it was a good degree worse than it could have been. And then a little after that, I think we took a bit of a break from like cascading into Up the Beanstalk, and then I saw a tweet from friend of the channel, Mason Clark. He just had a screenshot of Elder Deep-Fiend in play in the Cascade Bean deck, and I wanted to try it, and this is kind of where I landed on how you should build a deck with Elder Deep-Fiend. And Deep-Fiend is like a very powerful card in this deck. It lets you have some really ridiculous turns, it increases your clock by a lot, but at the time of making this comment, I think that this plan is a little bit worse than like just playing some commandeers in your deck and playing some time warps. Unfortunately, not like much worse in my opinion, but like the biggest problem honestly is that this card is colorless and just like doesn't like pitch to anything. But man, when you Solitude in your opponent's upkeep and emerge, tapping everything down, drawing like 4 cards, 2 off the Solitude, 2 off the Deep-Fiend, it was really something else. And I still have the deck sleeved up in paper. And then sort of at this point in the metagame, the bean decks were like really popular, pretty prominent. And I kind of circled back to the Calibrated Blast deck, and I decided to start main decking Shieldred to combat opposing bean decks. And I really like this deck to like be able to just like cheese the bean mirrors by blasting your opponent for like 12 or 15, since their mana bases are pretty painful and they don't start gaining life until kind of late. And Shieldred is also a pretty good tool against them as well, and it also has like a pretty reasonable scam matchup. And this is a deck I would probably recommend. It's like, it can be a little clunky and it can be kind of hard to figure out what your range of keepable hands are, but it's also very explosive and your card quality is pretty high. And then kind of after we figured out the Elder Deep-Fiend tech, I thought that it was a interesting enough addition to the Allosaurus Rider deck that I wanted to circle back here with some more changes, this time playing Fire Ice also. I thought this was like a much better version of this deck, and I think that we had some powerful, interesting turns, but ultimately it just really did feel like people were just so ready to fight the Cascade Bean decks that it was just not a good time for it. You know, this archetype has kind of fallen out of favor so to some degree, so maybe this is something we can circle back to a little bit, but it is also still probably not the best Cascade Bean formula, unfortunately. And then pretty recently, I think this is the last bean deck we've played on stream, and one of the best ones is, you know, after all of this, after all of these Cascade Bean decks, we finally circled back to the Timeless Lotus archetype. And I, after some cooking and like looking through cards, I just realized that Cultivator Colossus is really, really ridiculous in this archetype. It's a bit better with Up the Beanstalk too, because your hand is like a lot more full, and Cultivator Colossus is just like this kind of crazy I win the game button in the Timeless Lotus deck. This is a deck we played on stream recently. I think we went 12-3 over the course of like 2 days, like 2 leagues one day, 1 league the next day. I played in the Modern Super League, got me to the semifinals, and is a deck that I will likely register at some tournaments in the future. I know it's still a little bit weird for some players to see Amulet of Vigor in a deck without Primeval Titan, and you know the Amulet Titan decks are like very tried and true formula, but again, what I like to do is try to reinvent those formulas, try to build them in ways other people have never built them before. And there's a lot to like about this deck over traditional Amulet Titan. The biggest thing is that you're a lot more resilient to cards like Solitude, Unholy Heat, you know, Fatal Push on your Dryad of the Elysian Grove. This deck is also, I think, a little bit faster. The deck kills very consistently on turn 3. And it's also really nice that your lands are a lot more streamlined, where you don't have to play cards like Teleria West, Slayer Stronghold, Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, you know, and all of your bounce lands can be green also. You don't have to play the Boros Garrison, which makes things a lot more streamlined, and you can have these like more explosive Amulet of Vigor starts more often because you have less of these other cards. The big downside is if your opponent removes your Amulet of Vigor, you are a lot more fragile, and so this is the kind of deck I would recommend if there's more creature removal, less disenchants compared to Amulet Titan. But it is a deck I would recommend, and again, I've just been liking it a lot. So that was it for all of the bean cooking over the Wild of Eldraine season. You know, it may seem like the season was all beans, but all of these decks were sprinkled together with a variety of other stuff, and I just kind of wanted to chronicle again the evolution of these decks, and where we started, where we finished up, and maybe give you an idea of where we might be going in the future. That being said, in the middle of all that, we were also doing a lot with like one of the most exciting cards to build with in Modern's history, Agatha's Soul Cauldron. a card that I definitely underrated coming into the season, a card that I thought was going to be a little bit too win more, a card that I thought would be need too many moving pieces, a card that would be like slow and non-interactive matchups, to a card that is just definitely a modern staple, absolute powerhouse, and just like a very, very exciting card to brew and deck build with. The first place I played Cauldron in is, of course, Hardened Scales, a deck that I put a lot of work in this year when the Ozolith Shattered Spire first got printed. A deck that I've played in a lot of tournaments, had some good challenge finishes with, and like at this point in the season was like just my go-to tournament deck. I think that's changed a little bit because like the archetype has just been like pretty weak against the bean builds of 4-color, but if the bean builds of 4-color are dipping a little bit, this is like a pretty good deck to choose, I think. We only were playing 2 Soul Cauldron in the very first build, but it was immediately really impressive, and we eventually ended up going from like 2 to 4 copies of Cauldron really quickly, and like I went from going to like I'm just not sure if this is going to be a card you want to be playing to this is a card that is good and has a lot of potential to build around, and boy did we build around it. And after figuring out Soul Cauldron was going to be a good modern card, the first thing I wanted to do was turn some creatures into a Gristlebrand, and I think the best thing in Modern to turn into a Gristlebrand is Shield the Apocalypse. So every time you pay 7 life, draw 7 cards, you're gaining 14 life back. We tried it first in this Asmo Cookbook Urza Saga shell, which I thought was okay, but I ended up feeling like it didn't have a lot of card selection. Like we have, Profane Tutor to set up the combo, we have Rona, but ultimately, like, not a lot of card selection, and like a lot of like dead air in the deck too, with all these cookbooks and Ovalchase Daredevils. So despite the fact that Asmo was another good ability to put onto a creature, it felt kind of unnecessary. And we ended up building this building with Falahi Archaeologist, with Orcish Bowmasters, and with 4 Preordained, 4 Sarens, Ransom, 4 Tainted Indulgence, no Urza Sagas, to get access to a lot more card selection. I think this version ended up being the better of the two. I think I forgot to mention this, but we also have 3 Mox Ambers and a Borborygmos Enraged, so that after you like turn your Children into a Gristlebrand, or just like Gristlebrand for a lot, you'll be able to draw your deck, find a Borborygmos Enraged, Thoughtseize yourself to discard it, and then play 2 Mox Ambers to either Goryo's Borborygmos or Cauldron Borborygmos to just throw your lands at your opponent to kill them. I thought this deck was pretty good. It kind of has the problem of like not splashing for white or green in the sideboard to be Leyline of the Void. I was playing Feed the Swarm instead, just because I think this is a deck that really likes to have a less painful mana base. You also do have like Bowmasters and Shieldred, so that you can like sometimes just like slam these and cheese if your opponent kept like a Leyline of the Void with not a lot else going on. But this is definitely a deck I'd like to return to again. I've kind of tried to work on the formula a little bit, try a few different things, and it's kind of difficult to figure out what direction this deck needs to go from here, but it feels like something that is a little bit underexplored, and if you like Reanimator variants, I'd recommend giving something like this a go. Then after spending a day or two on working on Gristlebrand, I spent some time trying to hammer out a Heliod the Sun-Crowned build. At the time, there were like a lot of these decks popping up, like green-white builds of Heliod that were just the same like failing formula that we'd seen in Modern for a long time, like the Collected Company, Spike Feeder, little green-white Centaur guy. And I wanted to play a build that was like potentially good, and I think this deck is that. We played a few different builds of it. This is kind of like where we ended on the first draft. We had very successful like first couple of streams with it. I think we were like 12-3, 13-2, something like that. This was before like the bean decks had started to take over in the format, and this deck was just very exciting. Being a creature-based Soul Cauldron deck with Idyllic range was really exciting, since you could just turn your fetch lands into a +1 counter, which would give all of your creatures all of your Agatha Soul Cauldron abilities, and also really, really powered up Walking Ballista. Like, this was kind of the first time I had played a Heliod deck and had been really excited to just play 4 copies of Walking Ballista, so that you could with Idyllic range and Agatha Soul Cauldron, the card was just significantly powered up. This deck also had some like potentially really cute fast combo kills, where you could go so I can't even remember how it works. I think you can kill on turn 3 if you go turn 2 Agatha's Soul Cauldron, turn 2 Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and then go Heliod on turn 3, play a Walking Ballista on 0, and then evoke a Solitude, Cauldron, exile the Ballista onto Solitude, and because Solitude already has lifelink, you don't need to use Heliod's ability, and you can just deal infinite damage on turn 3. Which requires a pretty specific hand, but kind of cool that you can potentially not draw and kill really fast. And I was pretty excited about having this deck be a more interactive deck too, where instead of just like I'm playing Collected Company, I'm just going to do my creature thing, the deck gets to play 4 copies of Solitude, 4 copies of Leyline Binding, and 4 copies of the One Ring as like a really good card advantage engine to like facilitate all of this removal and also help you like dig for your combo. And you know, a lot of people were kind of confused by the Leyline Bindings in this deck, and like, oh, a lot of people like, oh, Modern's awful, you're playing Leyline Binding in a mono white deck, and like, you know, those concerns are kind of valid, but for the most part, you're playing Leyline Binding because this is a white deck in Modern that wants to play a ton of fetch lands because you want to be able to like fetch your idyllic ranges really consistently. And if you're a white deck in Modern that's like mid-rangey and wants to play a lot of fetch lands, Binding is just like kind of exactly where you want to be. And so it was more that you're a white deck with a ton of fetches than just like Binding is so good you splash for it in a mono white deck. It was also kind of cool that Esper Sentinel was so strong in this build where you can like buff it with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and Idyllic Range and like make that card a lot more resilient against Esper Sentinels. That was something I liked a lot. And this is a deck I would recommend to you. I think this is, you know, one big sleeper from the season, big success. There's a build a little bit later that's kind of updated we'll get to in a minute. And then the next build, and this was like the next day after the Heliod deck, I think, was the first draft of the Mono-Blue Cauldron deck. Another really, really strong record. I think we were like 10-5, 11-4, something like that. But this was a mono-blue list with a like really low mana curve that had like this kind of backdoor infinite combo where you could turn your Rona into an Emery, and then with 2 Mox Ambers, you could make infinite mana that you could use on Urza or Walking Ballista to kill your opponent. But really this is like just mostly a value deck where like turning your Ledger Shredder into a Walking Ballista is crazy. Having Spellskite to protect all your stuff makes you like very difficult to interact with. Using Ornithopter, like turning your Ornithopter into an Urza and an Emery and a Rona, like makes putting this 0 mana creature go from like being kind of a mediocre card to like very fast, very powerful, very flexible card. I also really like, this was the first shell I played 4 copies of Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and I think I was playing 3 here in the Goryo's decks, 3 in the Heliod deck, since having this legendary artifact can be awkward to draw multiples of. But in a deck with 4 Ledger Shredder, 4 Rona, you just like can loot these away pretty quickly. And this was a deck that I liked a lot, and a deck that evolved a lot over the course of the season. And one of these, you know, these Cauldron decks in general are pretty bad against the Bean deck. The Bean decks are currently kind of falling out of favor. So, you know, if you like the Heliod deck, if you like the blue deck, this is kind of a good time to maybe be looking at them again, picking them up. And then after that build, it was a few days after that build, we were trying a more combo focused version with Incubation Druid and Sleep Cursed Fairy. I think this was a deck we brewed on stream. It's not super often we get to brew a deck on stream because like any brew has to start with an idea, and ideas just kind of have to happen organically. You can't force them to happen. But when they do happen on stream, it is pretty fun and exciting. But the idea is that if you turn Sleep Cursed Fairy into an Incubation Druid, or Incubation Druid into a Sleep Cursed Fairy, or any other creature into both, you get to make infinite mana. And this deck is a deck that can use infinite mana pretty well. I think we only played 1 league of this deck on stream, and we went 4-1, but I think it was also kind of apparent that we ran pretty hot, and that this was a build that was like probably a little bit too fragile to interaction. But also the deck is like mostly Pioneer legal, so we ended up working on it in Pioneer too. And the problem is you don't have Walking Ballista legal in Pioneer, but you can combo off with Secret Door, and then I can't remember the name of the creature, the 2 mana green blue creature that doubles your mana. You can pay 7 mana, reveal, put a non-human into play. The problem is that deck can't realistically click through the combo in time on Magic Online. So kind of a paper only deck. Maybe I'll make a video about it later, but this was kind of a fun build. At least, you know, if you like this kind of stuff, you could take a look at it. Maybe go a different direction with it too. Have some good ideas here. But after our foray with the Incubation Druid stuff, I think it was pretty clear that build was kind of too fragile. And what I liked about this build, though, was that without the Urza, the mana curve was like much lower. So after like some iterations, I ended up landing on this is like more or less like the current mono blue Cauldron list. And we're playing 4 Patchwork Automatons. Kind of interesting to see this card outside of Scales, but it is very good in this deck. You have a lot of 0-mana artifacts to grow it. Turning your Patchwork into a Walking Ballista is really, really good, really scary, and it just makes the deck like lower to the ground and a lot faster. You need a Shadow Spear in your deck if you're playing Patchwork. I don't think this is something I had in the earlier versions of the main deck. I think I was sideboarding it at the time. And I also, like, this is something I wasn't doing. I was just playing 1 Springleaf Drum as a Urza Saga target. It was just definitely way better to play 4 Springleaf Drum the whole time. Just so strong with your Ornithopter. Springleaf Drum also, like, really nice, kind of nice with Ronus sometimes, where you can, like, tap it to your Springleaf Drum and then untap it because you played a legendary spell like a Mox Amber or an Emery, and, you know, get an extra use out of it that way. That was something that comes up sometimes. Yeah, but this is the blue Cauldron list I'd recommend at the moment. I think this deck is also kind of slept on, a deck that is like unique, attacking from a different angle, very grindy, potentially very fast, and difficult to interact with too. And you know, if this is a deck if you're like an affinity gamer and you're looking for something new, this is definitely something I'd recommend. And then after a couple weeks of beaning and blue cauldroning and playing some other stuff, I wanted to circle back to the Heliod deck, and this was off. You know, this is the last bean deck for real. Just kind of after determining from the other list that Up the Beanstalk was a better card than the One Ring, and this Heliod deck that we had discovered a little bit earlier in the season was playing a lot of the tools that trigger Up the Beanstalk. I think it just made sense to play, and also already splashing green for Haywire Might, it just made sense to play this card instead and lower the mana curve. And what was cool about this shell is that you have Solitude and you have Leyline Binding to trigger Up the Beanstalk, but you also have 4 Ranger Captains that can tutor up Mikaeus the Lunarch or Walking Ballista. And then get 4 Walking Ballistas as cards. In the late game, you're spending 5-6 mana on to also trigger Up the Beanstalk and just draw a ton of cards. And then you have Elesh Thorns in the sideboard that can trigger the Beanstalk as well. I guess the Lunarch was a pretty interesting addition. It always felt pretty fine, but it was like clearly the worst card in the deck. But it was also like pretty common on your mana curve. You would go like turn 4, play a 1-drop, play a Ranger Captain, get Mikaeus, and the next turn have something to trigger Up the Beanstalk that was like reasonably impactful, which is kind of cool too. So this is roughly the build of Heliod I would recommend to you. I did think Up the Beanstalk was better than the One Ring in the shell. Surprise, surprise, your curve is lower, and you know, multiple rings in your opening hand can be awkward to draw. Any number of Up the Beanstalk is just always good and pretty good at keeping your hand full. So this is more or less where I'd be at with the deck, and you know, I wish you luck if you want to start playing with it. Also, kind of in the same way we went to update the Heliod list, you know, we played a little bit with Hardened Scales, this time with 4 copies of Agatha's Soul Cauldron. This is very close to the list I would play now. I think this is also the list I played in the first week of the Modern Super League, if I remember correctly. I do think that there's a few different card choices, but this is how I like to build Scales at the moment. You know, I'm still a big fan of not playing the pathways like Grove of the Burned Willows / Carplusian Forest. I like to sideboard my Welding Jars, blah, blah, blah. Hardened Scales Discord, please let me back in. And like I usually do, I end up getting a little bit weirder with the Cauldron decks at this point in the season. And this is kind of like a good illustration of what the process is like. You know, you have a lot of like good ideas that get hammered out, and you just have to try going deeper. And sometimes it works out, a lot of times it doesn't. But this was like a mono black zombie Cauldron deck where making your Carrion Feeder or Walking Ballista ended up being really powerful. Priest of the Forgotten Gods was an awesome ability. It was really cool in this deck where you'd play it on turn 2, and then if it died, you'd be able to Cauldron it back, and then you have these crazy chains where like you turn your Bloodghast into a Priest of the Forgotten Gods, sack your other two Bloodghasts, your Bloodghasts come back. You Scornblade Berserker to counter on the thing, do it again. This is like some crazy loops in this deck. You also had an infinite combo if you had a Cauldron exiled Walking Ballista and a Cauldron exiled Carrion Feeder on something with Giralf's Messenger, where you could remove the counter from the Walking Ballista ping something and then have something else be a Carrion Feeder, or just have Carrion Feeder in play, sack the Messenger, loop it, deal your opponent infinite damage. This deck was really cool and a ton of fun. I think that it probably should not have been playing Aether Vial as something that we landed on later. It's just because your curve is so low, you run out of action for Vial really quickly, and like despite like kind of meeting the prerequisites for Vial, I think you probably don't actually want to end up playing it, which is something I thought was kind of an interesting learning tool. The Scornblade Berserker was really cool. I also really liked playing Stitcher Supplier in the Agatha Soul Cauldron deck, a card that can sometimes be kind of dopey, but it's really, really cool that it fills your yard for Cauldron and then gives you like a good creature to put onto Cauldron, has like a relevant dice trigger, and like the card quality with this ends up going, or like the Stitcher Supplier as a card quality ends up going a lot higher than I usually will rate the card. And then that idea kind of led into this one, which was an evolution of like an older deck that we had 5-0'd a few times. This like green-black Tyvar Asmo Fauna Shaman deck, where Fauna Shaman is like not a card that you really think of being modern playable, right? But I think this card is good specifically when you have Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, to where you can activate the ability immediately, and if it dies, return it. And you have cards like Bloodghast in your deck, which are great to discard for value. Bloodghast and Oval Chase Daredevil, great to discard to value for Fauna Shaman. And then also Asmo to search up with Fauna Shaman and then play for 1 mana. So you always kind of have that baseline, or if Fauna Shaman untaps, I'm going to discard something, maybe something for value, and just play Asmo for 1 mana instead of like it being kind of like a clunky, recurable Green Sun Zenith, if that makes sense. And so to me, it made a lot of sense to try Agatha Soul Cauldron in the shell, since like it's kind of also like Tyvar. I think in retrospect, 4 copies of Cauldron is too many. This build, you probably should be playing 3. But at the time, I was just like so hyped up on the Cauldron juice, I guess. This was also the first shell that I played where we were trying to give our things Fulminator Mage's ability. And this was just like as a Fauna Shaman tutor target to kind of set up with, or potentially Fiend Artisan tutor target. To set up like destroying your opponent's lands every single turn. And that kind of evolved a little bit later into this collected company version. I do think if your plan is to just Fulminator Cauldron your opponent, this is how you should do it. We're back on the Stitcher Supplier plan, so you have these like Stitcher Supplier draws where you mill over a Grist or a Fulminator and you unearth them on turn 2, or you Cauldron the 3-drop on turn 2 and start activating Grist or sacking Fulminator Mage immediately, sacking Bloodghast turn after turn, and collecting company into the stuff. It was pretty fun, but also the kind of deck that is like, has very drastic matchup spread, where these kind of decks are very good against, I think, Titan and Tron and 4-color Omnath and like Cascade decks, but also like not very good against decks like Scam, decks like Murktide. And then while I was still like very hyped on Agatha's Soul Cauldron, I wanted to try it in Elves. I thought the idea of turning all your stuff into an Elvish Archdruid was really cool. Like turning your stuff into Heritage Druid was really cool, and also like protecting your creatures. Orcish Bowmaster with the +1 counter was kind of interesting. We played 1 league of this deck on stream. I think we went 4-1, but I think it was kind of clear that like Agatha's Soul Cauldron was not actually a good fit for the deck. And we did return to Elves later this season, but ended up thinking Agatha's Soul Cauldron was not a good fit for the shell overall. And this is the Elves build I ended up settling on. We played this much later, pretty recently actually, but I did actually think Elven Chorus, kind of in the same spot of a couple cards different, as like this kind of grindy card advantage tool was like much better. It's also nice to have a card advantage engine in Modern that doesn't draw cards against Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred. And you might think that, and this was something I thought at first too, was that Elven Chorus was kind of awkward in Elves because it gives your creatures the ability to tap for a mana, but your Elves, right, all of your stuff already taps for a mana. But in actuality, giving your Twinen's Elite, Elvish Warmaster, the tokens those cards create, your Quarian Ranger, the ability to tap for mana is really, really good. Like giving these, like making these into mana Elves that tap for mana is kind of crazy, especially when you get to just go through your deck with the Chorus. And then also turning your Nettle Sentinel, the 2/2 that untaps when you cast a green spell, making this something that can tap for mana lets you go through your deck really quickly as well. It's kind of funny, like I thought Elven Chorus was way better than Cauldron. When we played our leagues, like I think we were like 3-2 a couple times. Chorus was like, I think clearly much better than Cauldron, but we also just like in the sample size didn't draw Chorus very often, and then got Furied more often than we did with Cauldron. But I think this was a better innovation, and maybe Elves is still like a metagame adjustment, or like one good card away from like being a somewhat reasonable Modern deck again. At least I kind of have hopes. And then around this time, I had this update to the Cauldron Zombies deck, where I was working on the deck for a long time, trying to find a different angle of attack. And this was also around the time where I realized Phyrexian Crusader, 2-mana 2/2 infect protection from white and red, was really good in this format of like Solitude's Furies and Leyline Bindings. And it was like a weirdly good fit in this shell too, where it was a zombie to recur your Gravecrawlers, and it was a really good creature to turn into a carrion feeder where you could just sack stuff to make bigger. Cauldron also makes your Crusader bigger, and if you turn your Crusader into a walking ballista, the damage you deal from that walking ballista deals infect damage too. So I found myself like two-shotting my opponents with this like very hard to kill Phyrexian Crusader, and thought it was like a cool metagamed build, but also like when you play against like these Solitude Fury decks and you just never draw a Crusader, you do end up feeling kind of silly. Then we kind of started spiraling a little bit. This was a deck that was a chat suggestion that if you turned your War Elemental into a Walking Ballista with Agatha Soul Cauldron, you could deal infinite damage. War Elemental card, I imagine a lot of y'all haven't seen or hadn't seen before this this league we played with it. But it's a 3-mana 1/1. When it comes into play, you sacrifice it unless an opponent was dealt damage that's this turn. So even if this triggers on the stack, you can respond to that Cauldron, turn this into a ballista, remove the counter, ping your opponent, put a counter back on the War Elemental. And we had like so many cool pieces of this build where we had Goblin Engineer that could put your Agatha Soul Cauldron in the graveyard to get your Cauldron, or if you already had Cauldron, you could put Ballista in the graveyard so you're ready to exile it with your Cauldron. We had Flamekin Harbinger as a tutor for War Elemental, and is also just like 1-mana 1/1s are way better in Cauldron decks because you can turn them into creatures with abilities. We had Spellskite as protection, also Artifact for Goblin Engineer synergy. We had Recruiter with like not only the War Elemental as a tutor target, lots of other good tutor targets. We had Fury as a Flamekin Harbinger target. We had Phyrexian Dragon Engine as a card advantage for Goblin Engineer. We had a Spellskite for protection. I already said the Spellskite for protection. I think this was a really good Aether Vial deck too. We had so many cool moving pieces, and this deck was I think awful. I don't know, like sometimes, and this is like the most painful part of brewing, is that you just have a deck with so many cool. Oh, we also Flamekin Harbinger could get Fulminator Mage for like the Cauldron Fulminator Mage loops. It's just so sweet, so many cool ideas, but just kind of clunky and low power level and very fragile 3-card combo at the end of the day what you're built around. So not a deck that ended up working out. And then like later that same stream we kind of like started cooking really hard because I came to the stream with this after working on it all night. It just wasn't going very well, and so we tried like this green-white version of like somehow the same idea where Siegehorn Ceratops, sorry, this is a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever it's dealt damage, put 2 counters on it. So if you turn this into a ballista, you can ping it, put 2 counters on it, remove one of the counters, ping it, 2 more counters, then on your opponent's turn, ping them for infinite. And it's kind of cool that this card is 2 mana instead of 3 mana, and it's a 2/2 instead of a 1/1 in the Bowmaster format, and it's green-white, so you can be more into like the Heliod style stuff, and maybe you play Ancient Stirrings and dig for your Cauldron with Ancient Stirrings instead of Goblin Engineer, and you still have a lot of the same similar tools, and this deck was also like it just didn't perform very well at all. But it was a fun brewing session with y'all, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, but not a deck I'd recommend, and probably one of the worst decks we played this season. And we kept cooking, and at some point I got really obsessed with Pippin, Guard of the Citadel. This is a 2-mana 2/2 Vigilance Ward 1. Tap, give another target creature protection from another card type to the end of turn. This is a card I had wanted to cast in Modern for a long time, since Lord of the Rings. A card that I think is very good. I still think this card is very good, but just didn't really have a reasonable shell. And so we kind of got cooking a little bit with Pippin. And we ended up playing it with Sky Strike Officer, which is a 3-mana 2/3. Whenever it attacks, you make a soldier token, and you can tap 3 untapped soldiers. You control it and draw a card. And it's kind of cool that Pippin is as Vigilance, so it's easier to have this tap ability. Esper Sentinel, also soldier, easier for the tap ability. And then you also have Lavinia and Boromir as other soldiers that were pretty good at stopping all of like the Cascade Evoke shenanigans that were going on in the format. And you can also be like the idyllic range mana base, so like your Ballista stuff is better. You can Ranger Captain for Ballista. Ranger Captain's also a soldier. This deck was pretty cool. Lots of good ideas. I think compared to the other like more out there Cauldron decks like this one was better. I think we had like slightly winning records with it, but not really a deck I'd recommend. In a deck like if you ever get like one more really good soldier tribal payoff, we're cooking. And then I think this was another deck we brewed on stream, trying to play Agatha Soul Cauldron in Tron. And what's kind of, so this is kind of like removing hardened scales from the scales deck and playing Tron lands instead, so that you can like sink that mana into Hangerback Walker, Walking Ballista, and then you can get access to Karn the Great Creator as like a different angle of attack. And this was like another, it's kind of like Elves, where like we played this on the stream and we went 4-1, but I think it was kind of clear the deck was not very good. But it was also, I was also kind of obsessed for a long time of playing a Cauldron deck with Tron, with Golos and Core Tapper as like two really powerful artifact creatures with good activated abilities. And it's cool that Agatha's Soul Cauldron lets you use any colored mana, including colorless mana, for Golos's ability. But there just wasn't like any other like Tron focused artifact creatures besides Walking Ballista that you could play in this kind of shell. So I think we end up having to lean a little bit too much into the hardened scale stuff. But this was like such a really, really cool out there deck. And not a deck that I think is very good. I would just play like other Tron builds, other scales builds, but could be a fun F&M deck. So that's a wrap on Agatha's Soul Cauldron for this season. Just like such a delight of a card to deck build with. A lot of good stuff, a lot of fun stuff, and a lot of stuff I think I'm going to be like, just definitely a card that is going to be a card we brew with every single time a new good modern creature with an activated ability gets printed. That being said, there's a third modern staple printed from Wilds of Eldraine that we were playing with and building with. A card that I think is, like Up the Beanstalk and Cauldron are just so special, and the fact that you can just do so much with them. Questing Druid, you can do some stuff with it. It is a card that goes in like a lot of green and red decks with low mana curves, but ultimately, like the quantity of those decks is kind of limited. So like this was, I think, one of the first decks we played from Wilds of Eldraine, maybe like day 3 kind of stuff. Red Green Prowess with Questing Druid, and it's kind of funny. Like this deck is like right now, like 2 months later, starting to pick up a bit more in popularity. Very similar to this shell we had like just day one. Although I was still like kind of in on my Dreadhorde Arcanist era. I probably wouldn't play this card at this moment. I wasn't sure, like, do we want one extra creature? Like, is Questing Druid more of a creature? Is it more of like a card advantage spell? But I think I played like 1 league of this, maybe 2 leagues of this. Had a good record with it. Thought Questing Druid was great. Thought Questing Druid was so good. But I've just played so many prowess decks on this channel with a very similar formula that I ended up getting kind of bored of it. And so it was kind of a long time before, like, from this deck where we even heard from Questing Druid at all. Where it really started with Andrea Mengucci, who was playing a lot of the like teamer Murktide shell with Questing Druid instead, that the card started to really pick up in popularity. And so it was kind of like around that time, it was like 3 or 4 weeks ago, that I wanted to try to find another different shell for it, because like I knew the card was good, I liked it. Like how Andrea found a good shell for it with the Murktide shell. Are there more Questing Druid packages we can play? And so I put it in the like Shrapnel Blast, Galvanic Blast shell as well, and I thought that this was I think this stream ended up going worse than I expected it to, a little bit worse from my off-stream testing. Our record was just kind of mediocre, and it wasn't like, the deck didn't feel as like cohesive as other blast builds have felt in the past. Not sure if I just ran bad or if there was like a flaw in this deck building that I still can't figure out, but I did leave that stream still thinking that Questing Druid was a good card and a card I wanted to be playing with some more. But after the Blast deck, I was still determined to find more decks that are interested in a cheap 2-mana creature-based card advantage engine, which led me to humans. Questing Druid is a human. Questing Druid in this deck is basically just a champion of the parish that has a draw 2 adventure mode stapled to it, which is pretty good. And humans is also a deck that like I think is interested in having access to a card advantage card. And I think Questing Druid felt good in this deck. It was a card that I liked. We went 3-2 both times we played a league with this humans deck. But ultimately it did still feel like we were playing humans in modern. Humans is a typal deck that is kind of struggling in a format where the top 2 decks are just like piles and piles of good removal. You can still beat those decks sometimes. You have a lot of good tools against removal. You have cards like Unsettled Mariner and Coppercoat Vanguard and Lavinia and Boromir, and also Questing Druid as like a source of card advantage. But it wasn't a deck that I was like super duper excited about, and is still maybe like one good human or one big format change away from being a deck that you want to play in a modern tournament. That being said, after that deck, I did find a Questing Druid deck that I wanted to play in a Modern tournament. And actually, just this last weekend came 10th place in like a 170 person Modern challenge with this list. This is kind of a weird deck. There's a bunch of YouTube videos of it up on the channel, but this is a kind of a red-green storm deck, but it's not really a storm deck. It's kind of hard to describe the formula here, but the way I kind of think about it is that you're kind of like Murktide, right? You have 4 Ragavan, 4 Channeler, 4 Lightning Bolt, 4 Unholy Heat. So you have this like really low mana curve of all the best red 1-drops, this formula that you've seen in Murktide, right, and in Grixis Shadow before. But instead of using like counter magic to back up this plan, you have this like very powerful combo finish. And despite being a storm deck with no with no Pyretic Ritual, Desperate Ritual, you really just don't need that much to go off. You usually need a Goblin and Archimancer, although sometimes you can have like 2 Channelers and a Manamorphose and your Underworld Breach. But a Goblin and Archimancer and a Manamorphose just lets you like, and Underworld Breach lets you start drawing so many cards and churning through your deck, and that is what this deck does really well. With 4 Questing Druid, 4 Abundant Harvest, 4 Rin's Resolve, 4 Manamorphose, 4 Mishra's Bauble, 4 Dragon Rage's Channeler, you just churn through your deck so quickly. You see so many cards, and you're able to just like outvalue your opponent a lot of the times via your cheap removal and card advantage and your Ragavans. And a lot of times, if you're just not able to win that grindy game, like if you're against 4th color, you're able to grape shot your opponent for tons and tons and tons, which is really exciting. This is also like a formula that you saw in the green-red prowess deck. This is something that we had kind of hammered out like a year ago, maybe 2 years ago at this point, where you can play really low land counts. We have 16 lands here, 15 lands here, plus the Abundant Harvest to allow you to hit those land drops. And this is a pretty nice way to like make sure you're hitting a density of spells in these decks that care about casting a lot of spells, while also kind of ensuring that you don't flood out. This is like maybe my second or third favorite brew from the season. A deck that I think a lot of people are kind of sleeping on. A deck that I think is great. It feels like it has very few weak matchups. Feel like it's very powerful, very fast, very consistent. A deck that I would greatly recommend to you, and something you'll probably see me play in more tournaments down the line. And in the middle of this, really towards the beginning of the season, we had like a week or 2 weeks where we were developing this food deck built around Knight of Sweet's Revenge, a deck that I still think is like very powerful and interesting and cool. I think this is also like the best build of these food mid-range decks we've played. But also, kind of entering a format where Force of Vigor is more popular, more prominent, and like not as necessarily an environment that I could really recommend playing a food deck. But it was very cool to see how this deck evolved. So Knight of Sweet's Revenge is a 4-mana enchantment that when it enters the battlefield, you can make a food token, and it gives your foods the ability to tap and make green mana. And it was very like apparent, I think, to me after I started to play with this, that this card was kind of like Urza Lord High Artificer, but not as fragile. A mana engine that you could like really count on, and in a lot of ways, like also very, very important that this is a green card, so that you can on turn 4 fetch your Gingerbread Cabin in your green food-based deck and have 2 foods to like immediately start like going off with. Or if you have like a Peregrine Took in play, you fetch your Gingerbread Cabin, get 2 foods, play Knight of Sweet's Revenge, get 2 more foods, and have like Knight of Sweet's Revenge just pays for itself immediately. And also what's really cool is the card is a built-in win condition where you can spend 7 mana, sacrifice it, and pump your team for each food you control. And so you can just find yourself either using that to win the game for like 50 or 60, or you can sink like a ton of mana into a big finale of devastation and get a big hasty Gilded Goose or something. Found myself winning a lot of games that way. So this was kind of like the first draft of the deck, very safe, very straightforward. And I ended up getting like, I think, a few things wrong about it. More specifically was that I wanted some more cheap cards. I feel like the mana curve was a little bit high with this build, and I was trying to play next Ancient Stirrings and the One Ring, where Ancient Stirrings finding your cookbook Manufactor Ring was really exciting, and then worst case scenario, it's usually just gonna be able to find you a land. And obviously One Ring, very powerful card and very nice when you have like a good mana engine like this, and also kind of like more conceptually the deck is trying to get to 4 mana and start taking over the game, and the One Ring is a really good card at doing that. But Also in this build, I was trying out mini partings. 1 mana green, search your library for a basic land card, put it into your hand, make a food token. And I expected this card to not be as good as Ancient Stirrings, like Ancient Stirrings being such a powerful card selection engine. I thought, or a spell was, I thought for sure was better than making, or playing a spell that just can find a basic land. But mini partings was, I think, immediately apparent that this was a really, really big deal for the deck, and was like the main card that I missed earlier. Because when you're going off with this deck, you have like a Manufactor or a Peregrine Took in play, and you're using these cards to like draw a ton of cards and make mana off Knight of Sweet Revenge. So being able to have these card advantage engines in play, you have your mana engine with Knight of Sweet Revenge, to have just like such a density of cheap cards in your deck that you can draw and make a food token is a big deal. Because if you have 2 Manufactors and a Took, every time you make a food, you're making 3 food, 2 treasure, 2 clues, which is 5 mana. And if Peregrine Took can draw a card for 0, and you can spend 2 mana to like draw a card with the Manufactor. And so when you have so many cheap cards in your deck that can make a food immediately, it becomes so easy to chain through your deck and just draw your entire deck incredibly consistently and win the game on the spot with a big finale or a Knight of Sweet Revenge. And it was so funny that just like this random 1 mana common from Lord of the Rings that I had never played before was the glue that tied the deck together. And so I was very, very confident that this was something we wanted playing moving forward, but I ended up feeling like the One Ring was, again, a little too high on the mana curve, and I wanted to try to lower it a little bit more by playing Experimental Confectioner. This is another new card from Wild's Eldraine that makes not infinite rats with Peregrine Took, but as many rats as you have cards in your library. And I thought Confectioner was fine. I like that it enters the battlefield and makes a food token. But I ultimately felt like the combo was like pretty unnecessary, and I found that despite having this combo, the majority of my games were like either just one with Finale or Knight anyway, or the games where I combo with Took and Confectioner, I would have been able to win the game just with my combo engine instead. And so that kind of leads us to where I am currently at with the list, kind of back in on Sand with Steelseeker, a card that I think is just like much better high card quality than Confectioner. This deck gives you a lot of card advantage and selection. For Peregrine Took has just become so impressive to me. After it took me like until this draft here that I started to play 4, and this is a deck, again, I think this deck is good. I think it's fast. I think it's powerful. I think it's consistent. I think it's a deck that is weak to Force of Vigor, like a lot of these artifact decks, but a deck that I if you're gonna want to play a food deck, this is the deck I would recommend to you. And I've spent a long time brewing food decks on the channel. I think this is the very best of all the ones I've ever played. That being said, this is a deck I'm kind of stuck on. I think that this is just kind of like the main deck I would see presenting for the foreseeable future. Maybe some things change about the sideboard, but the reason you haven't seen me play this deck on stream in like a month and a half is that I feel like the list is kind of solved. I hope that I can find some innovation for it, or they'll print a new food card soon, but for the most part, I just like to play new stuff on stream and don't like to just play the same 75 over and over and over again. And although it may have seemed like it from the beginning part of this video, we played a lot of different decks this season. It was not all Bean and Knight of Sweet Revenge and Cauldron and Questing Druid decks. We played a lot of different stuff, a lot of like miscellaneous brews and some updated older decks too. So I wanted to kind of like briefly go over them. So there's some good stuff here and some, definitely not so good stuff as well as there always is. I think this was like actually like the second deck I played in the Wild of Eldraine season. A Jund Saga list with Blossoming Tortoise and Lava Claw Reaches. Blossoming Tortoise has this ability, activate abilities of lands you control cost 1 less, and Lava Claw Reaches has the ability to pay X and give the creature +1/+0, or +X/+0 rather, and you can just activate for that for 1 infinite times to have an infinite power Lava Claw Reaches that maybe you can tutor up a Shadow Spirit and give trample lifelink to. I found this combo to surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, just not be very good. Very slow, gets chump blocked. Tortoise is really easy to kill. For the most part, if you're playing Jund midrange and you're slamming a grindy 4-mana spell, like Tortoise like was kind of reasonable at grinding, but if you're slamming like a grindy 4-drop, like you probably just want to play the One Ring or Shielded instead of like this card that requires you to untap with a land. And I did think about trying to play this combo and like some like Amulet of Vigor shells, but for the most part, I've kind of like shelved the idea. But who knows? Maybe one day, right? I also spent a little bit of time brewing with Beseech the Mirror, a card that I think is like pretty mediocre overall. Not a card that is unfortunately that exciting in Modern, but a card that when it first came out, I was pretty excited for it and wanted to like really try to get weird with it and play it in some like kind of non-traditional shells. And this was the first one I played it in. A deck built around using Beseech the Mirror to cast Restore Balance. You could also use Ask for Told to cast Restore Balance, and you would use the Border Post to pick up your lands to make your opponent sack more lands, and you could also use Urza Saga to search Zuran Orb to sacrifice all your lands. And it was a pretty fun, cute idea. We ended up having, I think we went like 1-4 with it. It was like ultimately and unfortunately not that successful of a deck, but it was also like my first go with Beseech the Mirror, and I think we ended up having some slightly better builds of this card later. I think this was the next one. This was a kind of updated Semblance Anvil combo deck. You can find a lot of content built around using Semblance Anvil plus Mystic Forge to like draw your entire library, using Grinding Station to manipulate the top of your library, and eventually killing your opponent with multiple Mirror Retrievers just being infinitely looped with their Die's ability plus Grinding Station plus Semblance Anvil. And what was cool to me about trying Beseech in this shell was that we had played Tron with the Anvil combo in the past, but we could, instead of using the Tron lands, we could use the Cabal Coffers plus Urborg to give yourself easily enough black mana for Beseech the Mirror in your deck that, you know, is interested in playing Ichor Wellspring and Chromatic Star, Chromatic Sphere as like good things to sacrifice to the Beseech, Mirror Retriever 2. And you have a lot of good 4-mana spells to Beseech into: the One Ring, Mystic Forge, Karn the Great Creator, and also your Semblance Anvil. The big problem with this deck was that Coffer's mana is not as good as Tron mana in this archetype, in my opinion. You know, Ancient Stirrings and Sylvan Scrying do a good job of making sure you have 7 mana on turn 3 instead of 5 mana on turn 4. And also like the curve was a little bit high, just too many 4-drops, a little bit too fragile to counter Magic, in my opinion. But a cool idea, and an idea that like I was really excited about, but ultimately just didn't quite work out as well as I wanted it to. I also spent a little bit of time brewing with Elvish Archivist, another card from Wilds of Eldraine, a 2-mana 0/1. It says whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, put 2 counters on the Archivist, and then when one or more enchantments enter the battlefield, you draw a card. So I thought about playing it in kind of like a weird Hardened Scales list that was trying to like use Aether Vial to like vial in your Elvish Archivist, or play Elvish Archivist and vial something in on your opponent's turn to grow the Archivist on your opponent's turn. And I thought this concept was pretty cool. I think we went like 3-2 with this deck, only played like 1 league. I think it was like kind of immediately apparent that this was just not as good as traditional Hardened Scales. But it was kind of cool, slower, grindier. You draw a lot of cards off Urza Saga Hardened Scales. And I love building decks like this because even though it is, you know, just it's not as good as traditional Hardened Scales, starting here is how you get to like good builds of this deck in the future, when either other cards get printed, or you find like different ways to work on the formula, or, you know, certain aspects about the metagame change that would make a more slow, grindy deck like this more feasible. And then I also spent a little bit of time with Mosswood Dreadknight, another kind of interesting card from Wild of Eldraine. 2-mana 3/2 trample. When it dies, you can cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until your next turn, and then you can cast it as a creature because you cast it as an adventure. The adventure side is 2 mana, draw a card, lose 1 life. And so I thought it was kind of cool to play it in like the black mid-range shell that we've played in the past, but, you know, splashing obviously for green for Halfling and Dreadknight and Tarmogoyf, and then being the idea of playing green-black over red-black or Jund was that you could play a lot of copies of Field of Ruin slash Demolition Field. Not something you can do, I think, in red-black, since since you're a little bit more color intensive and you don't have Delighted Halfling as a good mana sink for this, or good way to sink mana into this rather, and then Jund obviously being a few too many colors. And this deck was very good against opposing black decks, but ultimately Mosswood Dreadknight was just like a card that was kind of like clunky and slow and underwhelming in the context of Modern, just not really what Modern is about, and maybe the kind of card that would have been phenomenal in 2016, 2017. But the reality is, like, in Modern, for the most part, you just are going to be able to build your deck in a way where you should have something to do with your mana every turn, or almost every turn. And so having these like top deck insurance cards, these super duper grindy cards are a little bit less useful these days because of how many different mana sinks that exist between, you know, creature lands and Cling to Dust, Escape cards, Companions, this kind of stuff. And then the next and maybe last Beseech deck, there may be one more Beseech deck on the list that we played, was a really fun Rakdos Living End scam deck. We're playing 4 Oliphant, 4 Troll of Khazad-dûm, the like land cyclers, and 4 Fury, 4 Grief, the evoke creatures, to get a bunch of stuff in the graveyard. And then we could set up to Beseech the Mirror for Living End and on like turn 4 and get these cards back. As like a very, very powerful turn 4 play. But you know, but beyond that, we were just like Rakdos scam with Ragavan and scam Fury, scam Grief, and Bowmasters. We also had Talisman to kind of like ramp into the Living End sometimes, and also sack Beseech. Deck was like very fun, very cool, but like not as good as regular scam, and like, you know, like just missing something. I like maybe missing that Beseech is, you know, a pretty interesting 4-mana card in the context of Modern, but ultimately like 4-mana cards are just, you know, not exactly where you want to be most of the time. Okay, there was one more Beseech the Mirror deck, and I think it was the worst one, although it was one of the coolest ones. Don't think this deck ever ended up making it to YouTube. Just all of the leagues were like pretty bad, but we're trying to use Beseech the Mirror as extra copies of Faith's Reward in the Eggs deck, and this was a deck that was circulating a little bit, and kind of my idea on it was that you could play Lotus Field as like a way to like sacrifice your lands when you're recurring them to Faith's Reward and Beseech, and then you also have, you know, of course, Amulet of Vigor to untap your Lotus Field, get that off your Urza Saga. Lotus Field also makes triple black for Beseech, and you can even sacrifice your Amulet of Vigor to Beseech to get Faith's Reward, and immediately comes back, and then in the process you're like sacking your Eggs to draw cards. And the problem is the deck just can't beat anything. It's weak to Graveyard Hate, it's weak to discard, it's weak to counter magic, it's weak to like Stony Silence effects, and it's also like kind of slow, kills on turn 4, and just not a deck you want to play in Modern, but like, or at least that I want to play in Modern. It is very cool, and you know, maybe it's your kind of thing, if not my kind of thing. This is another deck that I think got kind of slept on, a deck that I think was really good in testing, and is probably a little underrated at the moment. And it's nothing that's too crazy either. Like, this is Storm, a deck that's like pretty popular. This even using the Spikefield Hazard tech that came from a European tournament earlier this year, as, you know, ways to hit your land drops and kill opposing Orcish Bowmasters. But very simply put, the One Ring is very good in this deck. You're a deck that plays 4 Desperate Ritual, 4 Pyretic Ritual. You are pretty often just going to be able to play the One Ring on turn 2 or turn 3. When you play the Ring on turn 2, it's disgusting. It's just like such a crazy turn 2 play. And it's really, really gross in this deck, where having a high density of cards allows you to go off and storm off really well. It's also really nice, like in this deck, that you have a powerful thing to tap out for that is more resilient to removal. It's going to buy you time, and unlike tapping out for Brawl or Electromancer, it's like a huge powerful card advantage engine, a card that it was just, you know, it's the One Ring. It's kind of like, I kind of roll my eyes talking about it, but it was funny that like when we were playing this deck on stream, a lot of Storm pilots are like, this is something I saw in the chat several times. They're like, the One Ring looks great in this deck, and this is the best Storm has looked in a long time, but I'm a Storm player, I don't want to buy the One Ring. Which is fair, but if you're a Storm player, you want to play a good Storm deck, like this is one you should have in your inventory, and one that I think is like secretly pretty good. I also spent some time this season working on the no coffers build of Mono Black Midrange, a deck that I think was a pretty big hit in the build up to the Lord of the Rings Pro Tour, deck that we were playing with and winning with a lot on stream. A deck that Gabriel Nassif worked on in a big way, cut the Grief Scam package, which is something I liked. I liked Nassif's decision to cut that package from this deck, and so I wanted to kind of circle back and like kind of show how I would build kind of this non-Grief version of this deck. I just kind of a few things to hit the note on. This deck has a lot of the advantages of the Coffers deck, in the format being a like kind of less painful black mid-range deck with a lot of Field of Ruins is a good place to be. But unlike the Coffers deck, you get to play a real sideboard because you're not playing Karn the Great Creator, which is really nice because you have all these like dead fatal pushes and stuff, and your deck curves out at 4 anyways, so like you're kind of like always able to still cast your 4 drops on turn 4 like Coffers is, but you don't have those like really clunky hands that Coffers has with multiple Urborgs, multiple Cabal Coffers. That being said, Cabal Coffers is like a higher ceiling, lower floor deck, and this deck is like lower ceiling but also higher floor, if that makes sense. A deck that I still like, I think is a little bit underrated, but is like also just maybe not as powerful as Coffers. Kind of hard to say overall. I also spent a little bit of time iterating on Twiddlestorm, another deck that we were working on a lot in the Pro Tour season. There had been some lists popping up that were playing Underworld Breach, and like that's still like I think what most people consider to be the stock list. But I really liked this version where we got to play 4 Lotus Field, 4 Simic Growth Chamber. And what was exciting to me about Simic Growth Chamber is like you kind of have 8 copies of Lotus Field in your deck. Growth Chamber even has like some significant advantages over Lotus Field, and like adding the Growth Chambers and being only 2 colors, because it's tough to like lean on Growth Chamber and the build splashing for Underworld Breach. I felt like let the deck have a lot of consistency, and also playing 4 Serum Visions, 4 Preordain, 4 Sleight of Hand gave you that big extra degree of consistency too. And so the idea with this list was that you have 8 Lotus Fields, you have 12 cantrips, you are very consistently going to be able to ramp out a fast One Ring or a fast Ave Progenitor Ooze for a big storm count. And the way that this build wins is by building a ton of storm count, casting an Ave, and then casting a Time Warp. I liked it. I like this deck. It is a deck I would recommend working on if you are a Twiddlestorm gamer. There are some people who wanted to play Underworld Breach instead of like the Arboreal Grazer Ave package, and then play the blue-red bounce land instead of the green-blue bounce land. And I think that's something that sounds kind of interesting and something that I might recommend doing. That being said, the Arboreal Grazers are really nice when you're storming off, when you're drawing so many cards. Like, I do find myself using Arboreal Grazer for mana a lot of the time, and I'm not sure exactly how important this is to comboing off. Maybe with Underworld Breach, you just like, and / Wish, you just don't need it that much, but something to think about. A deck, another toolbox for all the Storm gamers out there. This was maybe my favorite Miscellaneous brew from the season, and a deck that's like about to get a lot better with the Lost Caverns of Ixalan getting a lot of like new cheap merfolk that make the deck. So you'll probably be seeing some of that on the YouTube channel going forward. I won't bore you too much with it, but the general idea is that Elven Chorus plus Pure Sight Miro allow you to exile your entire library until you find a copy of Thassa's Oracle. Then you get to cast Thassa's Oracle and then exile the rest of your deck to win the game. And what's kind of cool about this combo too is like if you don't have enough mana to do that, enough creatures, you can Pure Sight Miro, exile the top of your library until you find a subtlety from the top of your library, and then untap and win. That happened a lot of the time. And it's cool to me that like the combo, this 2-card combo is a powerful underplayed card advantage engine in Elven Chorus, and the other half is a 2-mana and a 2/2 merfolk in your merfolk deck. So the power level of these cards is like relatively high for 2 cards that go infinite together. So I was really excited to find this. I was cooking for a while. It like weirdly started from like this other 2-card merfolk combo that didn't work, and I got really excited about that deck, and I started looking for other things that maybe hadn't been found, and I think this deck is probably a little bit better. Just Elven Chorus is like a really, really good card in this deck, and will be a lot better with some of the new tools from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so keep your eyes out for that. I also spent a little bit of time circling back to the old 8-key deck. This is a deck that is trying to use the mana from Core Tapper, Astral Cornucopia / Chalice, these other charge counters plus these cards to build up a ton of mana and go kind of crazy. And I was doing really well with this deck off stream, just like ramping into Paradox Engine, winning really fast. And that was kind of the idea here, is that we're moving away from the keys and we're going really in on Paradox Engine. It was something that like ended up going really poorly on some stream, and I'm honestly like at a loss as to how I would build this deck now. It's a deck that we've played a lot on stream, is really fun, is like one of my favorite decks historically to play, and I feel like I've gotten a little bit lost in the sauce with it. I just kind of have to put it down for a while unless we get a new tool, but I don't know. I just have no idea where I'm at. I've just played too many different versions at this point, and my mind is completely gone. Also, I don't know. This is a deck I kind of liked, actually. This is a completely colorless build of Affinity. Trying to lean in on Etch Champion being really good against Bean and Scam. Etch Champion 3-mana 2/2. As long as you have Metalcraft as protection from all colors, and so playing a colorless build lets you play 4 Darksteel Citadel, 4 Treasure Vault, the 8 untapped artifact lands. So this will be Metalcrafted very consistently. It was really cool that you have 4 Patchworks, 4 Ets Champions as like these very resilient creatures to tap out for, and you have 4 Cranial Plating, 4 Nettle Cyst as ways to buff these creatures up a lot. You also have Arcbound Ravager too to buff them. You also like randomly get Umori as a companion, and it's kind of cool that Umori is a black companion, and Cranial Plating requires black mana to attach. So the basic lands that you choose to play for Field of Ruins / Miscellaneous can be swamps, and they facilitate both of these roles. And this deck was like okay. It was a deck that I think was pretty neutral, pretty average, and a deck that you could like maybe get weird with as a metagame decision, but is ultimately like still an affinity deck in the Force of Vigor format. And that was a recap of the very exciting Wilds of Eldraine season. It wasn't that different from other seasons in the past. I think it's pretty comparable to the same number of unique decks I try on stream. I'm always trying to do new stuff, trying to reinvent formulas, trying to find brews that people haven't played before, trying to iterate on existing formulas. But this season was something special, I think, because we just had 3 really new, exciting, good modern staples, and it was just a delight to get to play with them. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of video. It was my first time trying to make something like this, but I work really hard at trying to innovate and try new stuff in Magic. So I think it makes sense to try to like document it. At the very least, I had fun making this video, and hopefully I'll continue to do this as the sets release. So I'll see you on Ixalan. New set comes out tomorrow. See you there. Bye bye.